I actually have a very easy job, as it turns out. And so I'm going to let all of them do the talking. So this is our report out, right, from these breakout sessions that most of you just attended. And, not all the subjects were selected, as it turns out. And we have a number of topics that you were given the choice of, right? And so each table self-selected the topic, as you probably know. And so I'm just going to kind of go down this list, and then whoever is the person representing that group, then just please speak up. Start by introducing yourself, right? And we'll go from there. And we can just stay seated down. So did anybody do water and indoor moisture? As someone is pointing out, this is actually kind of a data point in itself, right? If there's no interest in that topic, at least among this group of people. All right, let's go to indoor air quality. Any takers? There's a near one, but not quite. All right. Psychosocial outcomes in urban green space. Yes. Okay. Physical activity. Yes. All right. We're in luck. Well, that's good. That's good. So here's the mic.
Oh, great. Okay. Hello. All right. So even though we had one group, I have multiple sheets of paper, so I'll consolidate down to one. Okay, so everyone's familiar with the two questions. And so our first discussion about physical activity in relation to HIBR, we focused on the gaps and needs to advance and innovate within HIBR. And so we talked about the gaps being primarily, first we started talking about scale. So physical activity can occur at multiple scales and across multiple different types of buildings. So we're talking about the home environment, the workplace environment, or the built environment as you're walking to work. And so that kind of determines how you're framing how physical activity can be incorporated into HIBR strategies. The second thing we talked about was linking design and programming. And that kind of gets back to some previous speakers from this afternoon about the software and the hardware. And for example, if you're looking at office environments in a corporate building or so, you might have a really great worksite wellness policy that has policies dedicated to offering time for physical activity or incentives. But we talked about how there's a potential for self-selection bias. And so the people that are already interested in being fit are going to be the ones that participate in that. And so on the other end of that, on the other hand, looking, I guess, at the more hardware, how can a building actually promote and make physical activity an easy choice, the default choice, and not necessarily the intention to change behavior, but more of like a cue to action, I guess, if that makes sense. And just for the sake of time, I'll go to the needs. Reducing the barrier between home and, so I guess it's, sorry. Okay, so I'll talk about this. We talked about data privacy and big data, and so how to link up the wearable devices that so many of us have. It's, I would say, approaching a ubiquitous tool that people are wearing wearable devices. So how do you manage the big data and then the issue of data privacy? And then just general education and awareness about physical activity in terms of how you can promote physical activity within buildings. And it doesn't have to be exercise. It doesn't have to be go to the gym. It can be 3 simple bouts of 10 minutes per day dispersed throughout the day. And so how can buildings can facilitate that type of activity, whether it's just walking with a trail or up and down steps. Anything else? Group, physical activity group? Okay, so, yeah, and I think I'll end with that, I guess.
Thank you very much. Let's see, did anybody do electromagnetic fields? Yes. Excuse me, please start by introducing yourself.
Of course. My name is J.R. Denson. I'm with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. It's a very long name, and we go by ACEEE for short. So my group may or may not have gone a little rogue. And we talked about a couple different issues, but mostly landed on air quality and electromagnetic fields. And so I'll just frame my comments quickly in the way of the problem and a solution in kind of what we talked about. So one of the problems with these particular issues is a lot of people just don't know a lot about them, particularly EMF, electromagnetic fields, and how they affect the public and people and children and whatnot. Children are people. And so just talking about the solution being talking about some educational initiatives that our various organizations are doing to help share the knowledge with the general public, with academics, with legislators, as well as trying to build collaborative relationships with organizations and try to get unsiloed, as we heard earlier, to try to work with professionals in an interdisciplinary way to be able to affect change in these areas.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, next, measurement methods for human health. All right.
Well, which is interesting.
Introduce yourself, please.
Okay, my name is Ulrike Passe. I'm an architect, and I work with Iowa State University as an associate professor. So I'm trying to represent three groups who talked about measurement methods for human health. So that may be already an indication that there's lots of interest. It was challenging in 10 minutes to compile the information from three groups. So one group certainly had a strong discussion about what is actually health. And our group, for example, sort of gathered behind the World Health Organization's definition of health. But of course, for the measurement of health, that can also be debated further. So certainly, as we all know, health is more than the absence of disease. And so in order to measure, we need to know what we want to measure. And so what the two other groups, of course, also then discussed was the question, do we measure the environment? Do we measure the people? And what do we measure from both? And I think the need and the gap, as far as we understand, we actually had none of the groups had a medical expert on the table, which was interesting. But what we all thought at that moment was that the measurements between the environmental conditions and the measurements which have come up and are available now on measuring the people, the occupants, the humans, how to connect them. That's a big gap, it seems. And then another aspect of the conversations, I hope I represent this correctly, is that if we know what the impacts are, first of all, we need to know what we can measure, but if we know what the impacts of these measurements are and of the content of the measurements, we need to do a lot of education about those impacts, because there's a lot of information out there about health impacts or impacts on health which have evolved over time. And I think we're at a point where this is evolving again about the knowledge of what impacts health. And so we then also later talked and combined here in our 5 topics that the changes in technology make a big difference. That was especially in one of the groups, all the different sensors, both environmental but also human-related sensors, are changing constantly and are evolving into a direction which also provide challenges. For example, we shouldn't use measurement tools which actually in the end affect negatively other impacts of the built environment or the human health. So the complexity of the topic, I think, was clear in all 3 groups. And the last topic I want to mention here is the question of the qualitative measurements of impacts on human health, the psychological, the impacts on moods, the question of feeling, the affects, and that we need to ask questions which actually study what we want to measure. if we ask survey questions, for example. So those were topics which were discussed. Also, the impacts of the outcome and how much measurement do we actually need, or how many measurements to define an impact and to have an outcome. Did I represent that correctly? All three groups? Anybody would like something to add? It was a very complex discussion in three groups by 3 times 6 people probably, so there's much more to discuss in this topic, I'm sure.
All right, last but not least, I think it's imagining the future, I believe, right? Please.
Very complex topic.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name's Whitney Austin Gray. I work at Delos. I'm focused, we helped pioneer the well building standard, but my background and training is in public health. And it's really exciting to talk about the future of health in buildings. And I know many people out there that have been here for almost 10 years since the very beginning of this. And I think there's no way that I'm going to be able to encapsulate all the different conversations that happen, because the topic future is a little bit big. And so it looks like we all took it from a little bit different directions. So I'm going to try to summarize it based on goals, structure, action, and translation. So I think the first thing is that the groups came together, and it's pretty clear that we have this incredible passion that we share. Some people said that, we're an endangered species. If you've not seen the video about us being the indoor generation, these are really compelling arguments to really examine where we're spending 90% of our time, what we're exposed to, and rethinking a vision where we're thriving and engaged in the future. We're not 1 in 4 buildings are a sick building. There's no such thing as a healthy building. A building just is healthy. So I think we were compelled by this vision and this mission. I think we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of new players in the room, and not everyone is in the same background or level. For some people, this was very new. For some people, we've been doing this for many years. And really making sure that our vision encapsulates everyone and multiple disciplines to be part of that. So defining a clear goal. The second thing is really, and I should say that also really looking at the nexus between research to practice. We feel like at NIH in particular, let's look at what we can do. I think there's a lot of conversation about wanting to do everything, but also being realistic about what does NIH bring to this conversation? How will NIH help to drive this specifically? So inside of that domain, we said, what would be the structure in order to get this goal or vision accomplished? So there was some conversation about really wanting to know what HIBR is, and maybe just having some more history for folks that are new. People wanted to understand what the structure was, so maybe even looking at who a director would be. We love the idea of ambassadors, someone who might be nominated, or fellows in the future. We also really wanted to see that there was actionable and trackable goals that would be part of HIBR. So there's a couple different ideas around how to take this to action. One thing we expressed is that there are people here that are in academic university settings, and you need money to do good research. And we need to be straightforward about understanding how the built environment will be specifically part of RFPs that are directed from NIH. Is that possible? How? NIH is set up largely based on disease and injury outcomes. So you've got the National Cancer Institute, for example. The built environment plays a role. You have a group that's looking at asthma and allergies. The built environment plays a role. The built environment, we'd argue, is across all those different sectors. So how do we start to pull that into the current RFPs that NIH is being involved with? How can we help inform that? So maybe there's a very strong academic research track, a very strong translation and practice track. So there's people here right now that say, tomorrow I've got a project, what do I do, tell me how. So the research that's going on maybe in the academic setting might not be pertinent today to what I'm doing, so I need to know how to work with other people directly to be able to disseminate this today on a project. And the third group is the translation group, trying to work between the research to practice. So we sort of looked at, could there be these 3 powerful tracks? And inside of those tracks, that people that come to be part of HIBR know exactly which track they're in, exactly what they're focused in, how they contribute, and what their goals are. And is that possible? Is that something we want to look at specific tracks? The last one is translation. I think this really big idea of just getting the message out and getting it out more broadly. So we had a lot of conversation about the ecosystem of government and nonprofit groups that are involved in health in buildings. So here is my alphabet. I have, tell me if I've forgotten one. I have HUD, AIA, ASID, ACSM, NIH, HHS, DOD, ACPM, IIDA, EPA, CDC, GSA, NIST, DOE, DIEHS, DIMH. So if you know all of those right now and exactly how they're working on this topic, I just volunteered you to help lead this initiative. So I think there are several people here that would just like to know, who are those groups? What are they doing? And it's really hard because we come to forums like this and we find the one person that's working in the one division of the sustainability department of the one agency, and we're not always sure how to connect those dots at different times when we're doing the research or doing the practice. And we think that NIH could play a really critical role in just providing like an ecosystem map of who's doing this, what are your names, how are you connected, to just try to bring that sort of connection together and be able to better communicate what these different departments and agencies are doing. And I think the last kind of component, I think, is on the communication side. There was this kind of conversation with a couple other groups around empowering a message. There is a message where we can ask, there's a message where we can tell, there's a message where we can look historically at risk. I think FDA was potentially put up as an agency and how they grew a little bit more from risk components and actually compelling an argument. So thinking really carefully about how we want to communicate that this is not an option, this is not a nice thing to do, this is an imperative. We want to empower people, and at the same time we want to be very clear in our communication and messaging. So I'm not sure we resolved that, but we're the future group, so we can just say that that's a really important part of communicating. So I think that defines that we want there to be a clear, powerful goal. We want there to be a structure that we believe that HIBR here at NIH can help to align on those goals. We think there's some clear action to how we're able to track those goals. And finally, we think there's a core part of translation to be able to disseminate the message. Okay, so what did I miss for all the other groups on future that I did not include?
You did a great job of summarizing who can talk about the future, right? That's a big unknown. We all had a pretty different approach. By the way, I'm Lisa Bartlett. I lead the lighting design studio at Davis Partnership Architects in Denver. And our groups all had a different approach. There were some common threads, and thank you for pulling out a lot of those and giving a really great structure. I did want to mention just two other items that our group talked about that were our big points of entree into this discussion, which were that we really feel like there needs to be an iterative process between researchers and designers or practitioners. We both feel the gap. Those who are in research are looking for the projects that can implement the research. Those of us in practice are looking for ways to access the research. So it's hard to see, but we looked at a funnel as that approach, that it's iterative, and as we collaborate more and more, we end up tightening the circle on the funnel to be able to come out with a result that's for the betterment of everybody. Our ask from NIH was twofold, and whether that is the HIBR or NIH or broader government agencies, the first part of the ask was to help collapse the funnel to get faster results, be involved in providing education, because having end users have access to education and data would really help us make better choices. For instance, we talked about EMR quite a bit. Our whole table was educated by a gentleman who's going to be speaking tomorrow about things we didn't know about EMR. And if NIH was more involved in sharing that data, more end users could be empowered to make healthy choices and do risk-benefit analysis. The other specific ask of NIH was that in many instances, implementing sustainable technologies or wellness, whether it's at an energy sustainability level or an individual wellness level, can be waylaid in practice by lack of budget. And if NIH was able to fund multiple seed projects that moved the progression into implementation more quickly and gave us more results that oftentimes are hindered by budget in the quotes real world, we would have more data to use to understand what solutions in the world of healthy buildings should be further studied and how we can bring those to market in a way that is both faster and more affordable. Barbara, did you have something you wanted to add? See, we're talking about the future, so we can dream big.
Thank you. It is crazy. When we talk about the future, it gets to be so big. But we had, in our table, we had a couple of things that really kind of boiled it all down to 2 points. One was the money, because we can't do anything without the money. And where is the money? It's in the different silos, and the different silos are not connected. We need to connect the silos. We need to get the money in the right places, or we can't do any of it, regardless of the great ideas we have. Second of all, we have to reimagine, and this came as a kind of a looking back at how HIBR evolved over all these years, from something that was a healthy building in air quality, and we look at those first 2 topics, the water and air, and how many of us chose to talk about water and air. We know that, we've done that. What it's really down to now is the human connection, the human-centric model. We need to make and do everything we can to make humanity safer, healthier. We have to change that paradigm from our children born today are not going to live as long as us. We need to change that, and we need to make that a top priority. We do know that we pay more attention to our animals than we do to people. We need to look at that paradigm of the endangered species and how it applies to humanity. We need to save our humanity.
All right, I think that's it. I think everybody from the Futures Group spoke at this point, I believe. So, okay, all right. So very good. We have a comment.
This mic is on, or is this mic on?
I think so, please.
One other thing to add, it was an initiative that started prior to Charles's retirement to create a private sector nonprofit portion to this. It can't be part of NIH, obviously, but some way to create that private sector part so that there's coordination between the private sector and the government and the academic. And I would like to bring that up again, and hopefully somebody can take the reins on this and get it started, because I think that's an important missing part of what we've got right now.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, with that, let's thank our volunteer facilitators one more time. So you can collect your cash prizes at the bottom of the stage. Yes. So if there are notes that you're carrying around from your breakout sessions, whether in this big piece of paper, the 11 by 17 one, or other notes that you want to share with us, by all means, please leave them with me or Linda or anybody. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks. All right, we got one more thing to do today, then we'll let you all go. And so we're going to do a quick wrap-up, sort of end-of-day announcements. So I'm going to take one slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Fernando to close us out. And so what I want to talk about is shown here. And first of all, I want to acknowledge the support from the National Science Foundation. And so they provided travel support, partial travel support, especially for many of the scholars, but also some of the other speakers and other participants as well. All right, so this is from the Environmental Sustainability Program at NSF. And Bruce Hamilton, who leads that program, I think he already left by now. Otherwise, I would ask him to stand up, but I don't see him in the audience at this point. All right, so the other thing I want to point out is that we recently got approval from the editor-in-chief to publish select papers that come out of this meeting. Okay, and so this journal, which I think many of you know, is called Building and Environment. It's an excellent journal, and I think extremely important and extremely relevant for this topic. And so by a special issue, that means we can publish something like 15 to 20 full-length journal papers in there. So what if you're interested, and let's say either you gave a presentation, you participated in a panel, you gave a poster, or if you just attended, and if you're interested in being considered to submit an article for this special issue, then I encourage you to contact one of us. We're all going to serve as co-editors for this special issue. So this, for instance, this is my email address right there. And so this is going to be the title of this special issue. And we want to get your initial contact. In other words, a brief abstract, whatever. Tell us what you're going to write about. All right? It doesn't have to be lengthy. It just can be in an email. It's fine. But you need to send that to us, to one of us, by August 1st, because we want to turn this around relatively quickly. And so after that, we'll make some decision about which ones to invite to submit full-length papers, and those full-length papers will be due by the end of the year. So these papers will go through the normal review process, right? That means some of them may get turned down. So, like always, there's no guarantee that your paper will actually get accepted. It will go through the normal review process for the journal building.